Uh, the next session, Finding Clarity, will start shortly, featuring Adam Higginbotham Manu Joseph in conversation with Hannah Beach. Adam Higginbotham's first book, Midnight in Chernobyl, The Untold Story of the World's Greatest Nuclear Disaster, is an international bestseller and has been translated into 25 languages, being named one of New York Times' best 10 books of 2019. Manu Joseph is an Indian novelist, journalist, and screenwriter. He is the author of 3 novels, including The Illicit Happiness of Other People, and among other honors, he is the winner of the Hindu Literature Prize and the American Pen Open Book Award.
Hello? Yes. I just wanted to thank Peta for lending me her reading glasses so I can actually see what's on the piece of paper in front of me. Janet Malcolm of The New Yorker once wrote something that I think is an indictment of our profession. She wrote, quote, "Every journalist who is not too stupid or full of himself to notice what is going on knows that what he does is morally indefensible. He's a kind of confidence man preying on people's vanity, ignorance, or loneliness, gaining their trust and betraying them without remorse." I think what she meant in deliberately provocative language is that to get at the truth, which is what Manu and Adam do so well, we play roles to get our sources to talk. We can be a friend or a confidant or an antagonist. We try to gain their trust, and then we are very, very skeptical of what they say. Because people, even when they don't mean to be, are unreliable. They can be propagandists for a regime or a Fortune 500 company. They may have experienced trauma that reshapes what they remember. Or they may tell one small truth that's part of a larger truth that's different. We're talking about this today at a time, I think, when truth feels more than ever contested. We now have the concept of truthiness. We have online trolls and the bots deliberately spreading disinformation, misinformation. We have Donald Rumsfeld's known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. But I think why we're all here today is that truth matters, especially when powerful governments or individuals don't want that truth out there. It matters to bring to light a massive nuclear cover-up by the Soviet Union. It matters to hold Indian officials and the caste system to account. Adam and Manuel, I'll start with a simple question. Are you con men? No. but seriously, it feels to me that your work really focuses on a desire to uncover hidden truths and complicated truths. And I wonder what it is about those hidden truths that you both find so compelling.
I'll go first.
Yes, rock, paper, scissors.
I think that what kind of motivates a lot of what I do is finding out individual people's stories, which are not, it's not, I don't have an interest in kind of uncovering secrets so much as stories that are neglected or forgotten or kind of previously unexplored. And it's those things that kind of help illuminate those larger hidden stories. So, it's not like I set out to write about Chernobyl to kind of, uncover a nuclear cover-up. I was interested in exploring the stories of the people who experienced it and then and using their experience to reconstruct the wider experience of living through it.
Mm-hmm. When people say be objective, what they mean is just agree with me. I think most things that people say is basically they're saying, why can't you be like me? Just be like me. So that's why to me, over the last 10 years, I've been a columnist. I've been a reporter before that. And I feel that people exist in a state of belief, but everybody deep down thinks they are objective. It's a bit like, I think, how everybody thinks they're beautiful. Even I think I'm beautiful, so that should give you an idea, And similarly, I think people at one level, they know they are a bundle of emotions, but they also believe that they're objective. Without that, they can't be sane. They also believe they are sane, which is another thing. So my job as a writer is not to irritate people like what many Indians think, but I find the gray zone very fascinating. Like for example, in India, I noticed that some people eat asparagus, and they are also people who know how to pronounce asparagus, and I call them the asparagus eaters. They are very posh, and invariably, they are against dams, they are against capitalism, and if there is an Israel-Palestine conflict at distance, you know that they'll be on the side of Palestine, or whoever the victim is. They are generally good people, but they also eat asparagus, and they never see anything strange with this whole pattern, you know. And I feel that most of the time, people are under pressure to belong to the tribe, so they need to believe in a few things, while the truth could be somewhere else. I don't think truth is particularly interesting, which is the problem with truth. Truth is usually more uninteresting than emotions, and that is the difficulty in the transmission of truth. And I find it's very exciting to be a writer, to try to uncover what could be the hidden truth in this ocean of emotions.
Manu, I wanted to follow up on two things you said, and also note that I used to have a cat named Asparagus, so I don't know how that fits into the asparagus eater narrative. You mentioned the war in Israel and Gaza, and the idea that facts can be marshaled to create different divergent truths. But you also mentioned the idea of objectivity, and I think in American journalism in particular, we're sort of obsessed with this idea of being objective. And my question is whether that search, that yearning for objectivity creates narratives that can sometimes be less truthful.
Interesting. I feel there are two important things here. As an Indian, I know that there is a moral reason for exaggeration to exist. Many times, the only way to protect the weak is through exaggeration and a bit of hyperbole, okay, where objectivity is not as important as storytelling, because these are very weak people who are oppressed by very strong people, and you don't want, sometimes as a reporter, you can see the point of why activists try to amplify some points, and you don't want to touch that. But at the same time, the problem is that, see, I feel that objectivity is the most misunderstood concept among human beings. So I don't know why. I mean, I don't think cows are objective, so I don't know why I said human beings. But anyway, we never know. There could be an objective cow. I feel that objectivity is not a virtue. It's a personality type. And I think that's what a lot of people don't get. And sometimes you see evidence in, say, comedians like Larry David, who are like, people think he's only being funny. But no, that is what you get when you see an objective man. It is not that they want to be right, or they have a problem, or they have a mental issue. It is that they can see some things clearly that a lot of people don't want to see. And that leads to a problem. And especially being objective is a big problem in, say, a marriage. It's very dangerous, and I don't advise it. But objective people are a type. And a lot of people want to be part of this club without bearing the consequences of being objective, because it's a very lonely path, I'm sure. So I feel people can't help it. Yeah. That's what I'm trying.
I may not take your marriage advice, but Adam, the more that we talk to our subjects, and the more that we realize that there are different versions of the truth out there, whether we call it objectivity or not, and we talk about sort of in writing this kind of Rashomon-like quality, because each person gives you a different version of truth, and then maybe you collate them all together and you create something out of that, a narrative. Can you tell me a little bit about the process by which you did that with your book?
Well, I mean, I think in a way that it's a technique that's implicitly designed to get around what you're talking about, which is the idea that objectivity is really just kind of bullshit. Because
except when Larry David does it. Except when Larry David does it. Yes.
Because it means that you can, because when you interview people about an incident, I mean, as you know, if you interview somebody about something that happened 10 minutes ago, then they're not going to get it completely right. Yeah. And if it was possible, you could interview 4 people simultaneously as something was happening, and they would all have a different view of it. So both because you want to try and get at what Woodward calls the best available version of the truth, in kind of recognition of the fact there's no such thing as objectivity, and also to make an interesting narrative, it's a very useful approach to tell the same story, especially if it's a big event like, the explosion of a nuclear reactor, for instance. It's just an exciting narrative device to see the same thing happen from a dozen different perspectives. And, in terms of doing it, it just means kind of going around and interviewing as many people as possible who are there and like picking up accounts from other places. And in so doing, you can also, in some cases, hopefully, it's essentially like gathering a series of transparencies that you can overlay on one another. And then, from the overlapping parts, you can discern a kind of one image that represents that best available version of the truth. So I think it's both, it's useful for kind of creating accuracy, but it's to me, it's more useful in creating an interesting narrative.
When you're talking to individuals, do you ever get a sort of like a spidey sense that what's being said to you is not true? Not necessarily because somebody's trying to twist the facts, but because, as you said, our memories are faulty. You remember a wall is blue, and then you look at a photo and you realize it's green.
We were actually, Manu and I were just discussing this before we came on, in the context of people who asked to be paid to be interviewed. And the fact that the minute you do that, you sort of poison the well. Instantly that you just can't trust what somebody's saying. But when you do start to doubt the veracity of what somebody's telling you, there's the obvious, easy way of dealing with it. If you're doing what I'm doing, is you just ask them more and more detailed questions, and their account will quite often, unless they're a kind of seasoned fabulist. And those kind of people usually advertise themselves pretty clearly in advance. Then their account will just get ragged very quickly, and you can tell that they're making it up or embroidering it, I would say.
On this blue and green, as a male, most of the things which I think are blue, I'm told by my daughter, are green. And then some things which I think are fruits are actually colors. So that's a different issue altogether. I feel that there's a misanthropic quality to objectivity, in the sense that I think only the misanthrope can have clarity. By misanthrope I don't mean someone who hates human beings, as the dictionary claims. I just think that we should be somewhat suspicious of the majority. If a large number of people are saying something, it's highly likely that it is not true, or there is something hidden there. Like, I'll give you an example. In fact, I don't know, you may have heard that farmers in India are committing suicide because they have a lot of debt. I feel that reasons are a very corrupt way of understanding our world. In fact, one of the great failures of journalism is that it has to take reasons very seriously, because I do not think that India's poor farmers are committing suicide because of debt. In India, there is a caste system in everything. You walk on the road also, there's a caste system, and there is a caste system in the attribution of suicide by the media. So if it is if it is an upper caste unmarried woman who has committed suicide, it is loneliness. And if it's an upper caste man who has committed suicide, it will be something very intellectual, okay? Or like it could be depression. And if it is a low caste person who has committed suicide, it is because of low caste. And if it is a very poor farmer who has committed suicide, they would attribute it to something like debt. Because the India's poor is not supposed to be depressed. You know, there is an assumption that depression is not available to them. While to me, suicide is always a depression story, and activists attribute whatever is convenient for their cause to a suicide, and they promote that to the media, and a completely wrong image is created. Why this is important is that what India needs is probably to look at it as a mental health issue and not as an economic issue. And then you will begin to solve the problem. And the second problem with this is that when activists promote a particular point of view because it's politically convenient for them, they trigger a lot of other depressed people in that same community, and that becomes very dangerous for people on the brink. So there is nobody, you listen to people and then you always, you know that for a particular kind of people, it just does not make sense. And every time I've said this in India, people get very upset because the poor farmer has to die only out of debt. You know, there is no other view which is decent because...
May I follow up on that? I mean, you brought up a criticism of the media as being sort of reductive or trying to blame everything on one rationale. I think we're at a moment where trust in the media and even in the act of history writing is at what feels like sort of an all-time low, and that people assume that you have agendas and biases, and we do. How do you get people to trust you? I mean, we talk partly about trusting what the people that we talk to say, but on the flip side, how do you get people to open up and speak with you?
I mean, in my experience, if you can just get in the room with somebody, then and spend time with them and convince them that, you know, your comments about con men and stuff notwithstanding, that if I can convince someone of my sincerity and my interest and the genuineness of my intent, once I get in the room with them, then usually you can get them to talk. But it means that I put a huge amount of effort into making my initial contact with those people. So even if it's just like agonizing over writing them a letter that, you know, explains what I want to do, indicates that I know something about them, that I've kind of researched their story to the extent that it's possible, and that I'm not going to be trying to con them out of, you know, into talking about things they don't want to talk about. Or if it's you know, being referred to them by someone, you know, obviously the best way of doing it is through contact with somebody else. So if you can be recommended and endorsed by someone else. But it really is then just getting in the room and listening to them and being interested, being demonstrably, obviously interested in what they're talking about. So the reason that Errol Morris came up with the Interrotron, you know, is he devised this camera system so that he could look someone in the eye while asking them questions and filming them. And I interviewed him once, and he explained that the most important part of his interview process is that when someone is talking to him and he's reading the question, is that when they look up, he has to be there looking them in the eye. And I think that kind of interaction is really important.
I mean, I wonder in the era of Zoom calls and you know, phone interviews, how you can build that kind of rapport.
Don't do Zoom interviews. That was my experience.
Yeah.
Because one of the most, you know, again, as you know, one of the most powerful things you can do when you're doing a telephone interview is leave silence, right? And almost everybody, except sociopaths, will be tempted to fill the silence. Yep. But what I found very quickly during the pandemic with doing Zoom interviews was you leave a silence and they just assume the signal's frozen. So then both of you are just kind of sitting there staring at one another for, you know, as long as it takes. So no, I stopped doing the book I'm finishing now. I stopped doing Zoom interviews as soon as possible for that reason.
And I presume also that you're both talking to people who aren't necessarily used to being asked questions and having to know that somebody actually cares about their story. Manu, when we were talking yesterday, you mentioned this idea of sort of cultural complexities and how they factor into the interview process. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I feel that the Western society is very confident. The individual is very confident, and as Westernized Asians or Westernized Indians, we try to be confident most of the time. But actually, in India, what works is that you have to be underestimated, in a room. If you're underestimated in a room, people like you and they speak more. They're more open about things, and sometimes it can get a bit interesting. Like, for example, I remember, a bit insulting also, how much a particular kind of person is willing to trust you. For example, about 10 years ago, I had done a story on an Indian call center where Christian evangelists were campaigning against sex. They didn't want the girls to have sex. They didn't care much about the boys. So they would join as employees purely to tell girls that they should follow Jesus, which somehow involves not having sex. And they just opened up immediately with me because, I don't know, I was wondering, it was a bit insulting because I thought I was one of them, that I'll get everything that they're saying, and I laughed with them, and I went along, and they told me everything. So I think, I think there's probably a bit of cunning involved, and unfortunately. But then, if you want to be a good reporter, you should not be a columnist. Now that I'm a columnist, I think it's a problem because people know your view, you're totally exposed, and nobody trusts or likes columnists, I think.
I want to switch a little bit to a sort of broader question, which is, as a journalist, to try to recreate what happened yesterday is quite difficult. To recreate what happened decades ago is even more difficult.
But more fun.
But more fun, yes. And I guess the question is, how do you balance this need for readability and narrative propulsion in what you do with an adherence to facts?
Without making it up,
Yeah, without making it up.
Well, I don't. It's a lot of work.
Yeah.
I would say is the short answer, because it just means that you have to gather information from an extremely wide variety of sources, and you come across a lot of stuff that you just can't. You can't have that moment in the narrative because you can't really tell what happened.
Yeah. I find often that I will spend hours trying to figure out whether the wall is blue or green. And I go down that rabbit hole, and then at the end of the day, I'm say, actually, the reader doesn't really care if it's blue or green.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's because I'm now fact-checking the new book, and so there are a lot of those sorts of details that I would either like put placeholders in for, or I would put TK, and then the fact check I'd be going over. I was doing this just the other day, going through something about a time of day, right? And the fact check would go, you haven't got this. I don't know where you can possibly get this from. What are we going to do about this? And I was like, okay, well, we've got all these other details in this paragraph. Let's just cut it. We don't need it. So once a lot of what I do is to try and accrue as many details as possible, and you can just go too far. So in an ideal world, if there's something you can't track down, you can just lose it.
You mentioned the idea of making it up. Manu, you've written novels, and I wonder, in some cases, when we're so focused as journalists on getting these facts, that the fact-seeking can get in the way of the larger universal truths, and fiction can actually allow you to get at those. How would you compare those two processes of writing fiction and doing something that is more of a narrative journalism?
Yeah. Sometimes when I used to write my novels, and you are struggling in a novel, you have to get some things. Some things have to be absolutely factual, like places, and cities so that people believe you when you're making up the other stuff, you know. Historical figures, what I do is historical figures, journalistic events, urban settings, I try to be extremely factual so that people are a bit confused about the fictional characters. Anyway, people are full of themselves. They think it's all about them. You know, in whatever happens in the novel is about them. So they also help you. But there are times when I'm struggling to be factual in a novel and I feel that why am I working so hard and then claiming that I made this all up? You know, that is the tragedy in writing a novel, that you try, you want to be factual about a few things, but you are claiming this never happened, this does not exist in this form. So that's a form of torture. The great thing about journalism is most of the time, the facts are very dry, but then there is that one moment, you know, in a reporter's life when something happens which is true, and at the same time it's so interesting that you absolutely love it, you know. So you live for those moments.
So if you could both tell me about those moments, is there sort of a crystallized moment where you uncovered a truth and you just felt so bloody happy with yourself?
I mean, that happened pretty much every time when I was reporting that Chernobyl book, when somebody would report a piece of direct speech. It was like gold dust, you know, a 5-word phrase that I could then put into the manuscript in quote marks. So every time that happened, there was one of those.
Unfortunately, I've never uncovered a truth in my reporting life, and that's why I claim as a novelist that all truths that really matter have no evidence, you know, because it's about parenthood and other things. But what I mean by great interesting moments, which are like, for example, once I was interviewing a very dangerous type of a Hindu political leader, and he called me home, and when I entered, so he met me outside. It was a small lawn, and his neighbors were all around. And he was performing for his neighbors by insulting me. He said, "You're a Christian, so you can't come in. So we'll sit outside." And I sat outside, and he was sitting on a swing, and he was swinging. And then his wife came and sat on the swing, and suddenly the swing stopped moving because she was heavy, and he could not swing any further. And I was loving everything. And he kept insulting. He said that we'll chop you into pieces and send you to Pakistan, which is a default thing that Hindu leaders used to say. And then he figured, you're a Christian, so I'll send you to England. And to me, as a writer, it was an exceptional moment, right? I mean, and these things usually, as scary as it can be, and it was probably scary then, but these are the things you encounter as a reporter, which kind of contributes to your writing, you know.
Did that become a column?
No, strangely, as reporters in India, we have very few rights, in the sense that for some reason, you're not supposed to be too interesting. You know, what happened to you does not matter. So I went there for Outlook magazine, so I did not mention this. So I mentioned this episode later as a columnist, that this happened to me when things are allowed to happen to you, you know, and you're allowed to talk about yourself a bit.
You know, when we talk to real people in real situations, and we're chasing the truth, we can often talk to people who can get into deep trouble, whether it's with governments or powerful people or even members of their own household who might weigh a lot and make the swing not work. How do you balance this need for truth or to uncover some big scandal with the need to actually protect people? And have you ever had instances where you've refrained from reporting something or sharing something to protect a person?
I don't think I ever have, because I've never done anything of that kind of worthwhile nature. You know, the closest I've come is I used to do a lot of crime reporting, but then I'd be, you know, if I was withholding anything, it would be to protect myself. On the one occasion when I didn't, I, you know, faced this long-lasting defamation suit as a result of naming the criminal mastermind who was in charge of this operation in which they stole and smuggled rhino horns from natural history museums around the world. But the case was eventually dropped, which is the only reason I can tell you about it. But no, I don't think. I think Manu's done much more, terrifying work like that than I have.
I'm just in a terrifying country, so it all sounds. Though once, when I was covering the Hindu-Muslim riot, there was a huge one in Gujarat. That was last of the big riots. Generally, there was this accusation that the chief minister of Gujarat let the riots against Muslims happen. Though both sides, hundreds on both sides died. And then I heard that one of his own ministers had deposed before a human rights delegation, where, and he sang, he seemed to suggest that he has some kind of an evidence that can point to the chief minister, But then I met him and I had to negotiate a deal, though he said that it will be very unsafe for me if you reveal my name. So I had to protect him, but in exchange I asked him for more information, like everything that he deposed and everything that he said. So I would have protected him anyway, so that I remember. Eventually he was murdered. But it was not how he feared he would go. Something else.
It wasn't your fault.
It was not my fault. In fact, it was quite. He would call me once in 3 months. Just be careful. It was very strange because he was a minister, and everybody presumed who the anonymous source was because he and the chief minister had serious problems. But for some reason, he thought that. Nobody knows. And it is very rare for an Indian minister to be so naive. But anyway, we went along and we protected his identity. But yeah.
I want to switch from people to documents and archives that are written by people. And in some ways, we tend, I think, to give more import to written words that are in dusty archives and in libraries. But obviously, they have their own biases. They're written by the victor. They're written by people who have access to paper to write things, or to computers to write things. And in your research, how do you look at what's written in the record, in this Soviet sort of propaganda versus what people are telling you, and sort of balance those two sides?
Well, you're right, because I think that your initial conviction is that anything that's written down that's contemporaneous is obviously more trustworthy than what somebody's telling you 40 years after the fact. But I looked at a lot of different varieties of documents, and one's initial conviction was that KGB documents that had been released from an archive, for example, would be more trustworthy because the people that were writing them never believed that anybody else except their immediate boss would be reading them. Whereas, what I discovered is there are transcripts of Politburo meetings, which I used, but I discovered by talking to Soviet specialists in academia that there would be like 4 different versions of a transcript of any given Politburo meeting, and they might all be subtly or significantly different. But again, I think you just have to map one thing against another so you can see what details agree with one another, and bear in mind the original intention and purpose of the documents. I mean, the best documents that I came across in researching the Chernobyl book it's kind of another demonstration of what I was talking about demonstrating your sincerity and intent. Because when I first went to Kiev to begin work on the book, I went to see the scientific director of the Chernobyl Museum they have there, which is this kind of fantastic repository of all this material that's been gathered for years. And at that time, nobody really went there. It was this kind of very dusty, old Ministry of the Interior building. And so me and my fixer went, and we met this woman who's fantastic. And we explained at great length what the idea of the book was. It was supposed to be this definitive account of this thing that happened for a Western audience. And she sat and patiently listened to me say this for 20 minutes in English. And then Taras, who was with me, translated the whole thing. So we're there for like, half an hour at least. And then she just went, well, that sounds great, but, there's absolutely no way that's possible. You're not going to be able to do that. And so we're like, okay, but partly for because of these ideas of objectivity. She said, you'll never be able to do that. So we thanked her and left. And I think that she just thought she'd never see us again. But we came back like 2 months later and we gave her the same speech all over again, and we'd interviewed some more people and done some more visits, and then she was a little bit more friendly and she gave us some tea and seemed to take us a bit more seriously. But still, was still quite skeptical about the whole concept of writing this damn book. And then like 2 months later, we came back again and we had a much more agreeable visit, tea, right out front of the meeting.
Snacks?
What?
Snacks.
Snacks, very chatty. And then we were getting up to leave. And literally as I was leaving, she said, I don't know, if you're serious about this, I've got this. And she kind of opened a drawer in the desk. And she said, I've got this that I think you might think is interesting. And she produced this file that was like this thick of documents. And she just put it on the table in front of me. And what it was the original MVD reporting file that had been opened on the day of the accident in the city of Pripyat, which is the town that was built to house the workers for the plant. And so the local militia had kept this file of everything that happened up until the point when the MVD station was evacuated 2 weeks later. And the only reason it existed is because immediately after the accident, or a couple of years later, it had been handed to a guy who had been told to destroy it. And he thought, I don't know, this might be kind of useful or important at some point in the future, and had put it in a box in his garage. And so after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the setting up of this museum, he showed up on her doorstep one day and said, here, do you want to keep this? But it was original, there's no other copy of it. And this was just this gold mine of like minute by minute accounting of what happened. And that I trusted.
It reminds me during the Cultural Revolution of Chinese photographers who took photographs and then, of some of the atrocities that were committed, and then knew that these were probably pretty important, and so they ended up burying them, in basements and other places. And then decades later, the negatives were dug up, and they've become books that have given us a pictorial record of actually what happened.
History is full of people who give material to their best friend to destroy. And that guy never destroys. Like Byron did it. There's an Indian writer called R.K. Narayan who he sent it to one publisher in UK to throw it in the river, I think they really don't want to destroy that material. I mean, because how difficult can it be to destroy material,
I think we may want to turn it over to questions from the audience. Does that sound good?
Are you choosing?
Hello. Thank you very much for being here, and I really appreciate all your talks. One of the things that I encounter a lot for people who want to reveal the truth is that they get a lot of backlash. So basically, like what Manu say, you try to go against, someone in power, the majority, and maybe they have some hidden agenda because they want to control people. You can just get attacked online. People might try to dox you, or how do you deal with these things as journalists, as columnists? You try to reveal the truth, you try to expose something, but then how do you deal with this emotionally as well? And yeah.
I think, Manu, you have almost certainly got more experience of this than I have.
Someone told me that they use my my column on Tinder as a filter, so that they kind of get a particular kind of people to click, because most I don't know how that works, but kind of that's quite innovative. I feel that, I mean, I would like to say that if you're a writer, you need to be lonely and you should be prepared for this and all that, but I wouldn't have conviction to say it is an unfortunate side of the world, but something very good has happened recently because it's not just me, everybody is losing friends. Earlier, 10 years ago, only a particular kind of people suddenly lost their contacts and friends because they had problems with something that you said. But now, increasingly, people are telling me that they said something at the dinner table and the personality has been revealed and the cousins are not talking, the old friends are not talking anymore. There is a problem within one of the most dangerous things, the family WhatsApp group. But all the middle-aged uncles have their own views and the girls are beginning to see the personalities of their patriarchs. It's happening to everyone, you know, so I'm glad. And actually that's a good thing. I know I'm sounding facetious because earlier only the writers to lose their tribe. But now the world is so split and it's such a mess that everybody, I think everybody is also behaving like writers, you know, because they have opinions, they are voicing it, but they're doing it free.
Could I follow up on that? Is there the possibility that given this polarization in the world that writing and truth-seeking and, you know, investigative books can try to bridge the divide, or are we just condemned to splitting apart?
I think that I think people are seeking emotions. I think people are very uncomfortable with certain truths, and I think people who want to know the truth, there are a particular type of people. I think they're very lucky, you know. And I feel that a new kind of semi-literacy has come about. A lot of people can read, but they can't read between the lines. So to me, it is amazing that how someone can see fake news, but they're not able to identify it as fake news, for instance. But I feel that writers and the mainstream media, I have more respect for mainstream media than ever. I used to be someone who believed in the democracy of social media earlier, you know, but I don't believe in that at all. I think Elon Musk, his view that it is the freedom of reach and all that kind of is a lot of bull. I feel that mainstream media should come back in a strong way, probably a more credible way, because there is also, to answer your question, there is a market for that, you know, some place that you can trust. I feel that there is a market for it today.
And I also think that, you know, because social media is driven almost entirely by anger, there's a much more vibrant market for untruths that make people angry.
And thank you for your presentations. I wanted to ask you about the use of language, and particularly in the aftermath of events in the Middle East. It seems that some of the language that was used by politicians just entered into what the media was saying about events, even if it was supposed to be descriptive. And that concerned me because I thought that it ratcheted up emotions and made it more difficult for people to try and take a step back from the situation and think about how it might be resolved. And so my question is, how do you think about using language when you're doing your writing or your reporting?
That's a really difficult question. I mean, I'm just, you know, working on these kind of books, I'm just trying to find the most accurate language I can to kind of recreate the moment in as immediate way as I possibly can and just communicate as clearly as I can. But because I'm not you know, reporting news events. I don't have to think about it, I think, in the way that you're talking about. Manu?
You know, as a writer who always wanted to be a novelist, and English is a foreign language at the same time an Indian language. It's one of those confusing things, you know, where like Indians like me are totally inarticulate. We don't speak any language well. My mother does not understand my Malayalam. My friends don't understand my Tamil. When I speak in Hindi, people start laughing, and you know, so it's one of the strange things. But as a writer, when I write in English, I used to try to write the beautiful prose, you know, because you, as a novelist, and you want to write well. But now I've lost not respect, but I don't hold the beautiful prose in you know highly. I just feel that a bit of a rough, a kind of a simple language is necessary. The reason why I'm telling you this, in case you're wondering, is that I feel, in fact, even I'm beginning to feel it. There is an anti-intellectual emotion in the society. And intellectuals tend to dismiss it as just the emotion of dumb people, you know. But it is not so, you know. Intellectuals are irritating, you know. And many times, people are reasonable, they have a middling view, and then they hear the sermonizing intellectual with that perfect accent and kind of complicated words, and they want to take the opposite view. In fact, I feel that people dislike intellectuals so much that when intellectuals make sense, people hate sense itself. In fact, that to me is the answer. Like, people are wondering, like, how can people be against vaccination? How can people be against climate change? This guy does not even read a book. What does he know about climate to take a position? It is very simple. Whatever the intellectual or the sermonizing person is saying, a particular kind of people who could be the majority, they want to believe in the opposite view, right? So though I am Indians who don't read call me an intellectual for some reason, because they just think all published authors are intellectuals. In fact, I encourage audience not to call me only because actually I have a lot of respect for intellectuals. I have a lot of respect for scholars, you know, because they're experts and they know stuff. But people have a blank idea of intellectuals as people who have an agenda, who are asparagus eaters, you know.
I think we have time for one or two more questions.
Hi, thanks for your talk today. I want to go back to something that Manu spoke about a little bit, which was being suspicious of the majority. And I think there are great situations where that can be a positive thing, and we can encourage people to do that, like back during the Soviet Union, some of the things they were speaking about. But if you look at modern examples, you encourage people to question them being suspicious of the majority. And you take something like the COVID vaccine a couple of years ago, and someone who is suspicious of that says, well, but actually it killed all these people. And you say, well, how do you know this? And they say, well, Pfizer is colluding with the WHO to do these things. So I guess, how do you encourage people to separate being suspicious of the majority from becoming a conspiracy theorist?
Yeah, there are exceptions, you know. Maybe I should qualify the suspicion of the majority, you know, maybe many abstract things, you know, which a majority believes in, you know, you can probably look at it with more suspicion, okay, while more established things. In fact, I believe in the wisdom of the crowd when it comes to more established norms, you know. But when there are esoteric things which suddenly a majority has gone for, you know, then I kind of try to look at it as like, what's wrong? What am I not seeing? You know, what is the truth within this trend? You know.
I think we have the wisdom of the crowds that the time is up. So we should say thank you very much to Manu and Adam for a lovely conversation.